Welcome to the Calm Cockpit Podcast, the show that helps pilots think clearly, stay calm, and perform at their best when it matters most. Each episode delivers practical strategies, real-world aviation wisdom, and mindset tools that help create confident pilots and safe flights.
Today, we're tackling the world of flight instruction, especially the idea that to become a great instructor, you have to start by reinventing everything from scratch.
Enter our guest, Nate Ehlers, founder of Backseat Pilot. Nate is a military pilot among the top 1% of military-trained aviators, and he currently flies for commercial airlines. He's also a long-time certified flight instructor who used his struggles to help make the path easier for all of us.
Nate founded Backseat Pilot on the principle that the CFI path feels overwhelming, but that people don't have to figure it out by themselves.
We'll discuss current training models and how rote knowledge can be streamlined, and also how to maximize your preparation to stop stressing out and get right to the teaching.
If you're a student, CFI, or curious if flight instruction might be a future path for you, Nate will give you the keys to the flight instruction kingdom.
The Calm Cockpit Podcast starts now.
Oscar, runway 27, clear for takeoff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. I'm Geeta Brown, certified yoga and meditation educator and music educator with over 30 years of teaching high performers how to improve their lives and their performance, but without adding stress.
And I'm John Niehaus, corporate pilot and flight instructor.
John, I know so many pilots who have instructed in one way or another. And I think we all end up teaching, whether it's formally as a certified flight instructor or not. It's kind of like baked into the aviation path. And I have to give a little shout out to my fellow midlife pilot, Brian Siskind, one of the co-hosts of the Midlife Pilot podcast, because he has started just kind of teaching a little ground school. And before you know it, he's going to be teaching more and more and more. And I feel like it's so baked into the culture. And once you fall in love with aviation, you start to want to share it with other people. Was it like that for you, or was it just like what you did because that was the path that you were on with the collegiate training?
It's a little bit of both. When you're going through that, especially on a collegiate path or a career path, it is to a point where it's kind of just something you almost do. There are a couple other paths out there to get you to that point, but there's just not a lot of ways. And I spent 14 years at NAFI trying to tell people that it's not just a means to an end, because for me, I started it as a means to an end and then found out that I loved it and that I was really good at it. So there's kind of this weird dichotomy between, yes, even I moved on to do other things, but I still try my best to keep a foot in that door because I just can't let it go. I enjoy it too much.
I think a lot of people can relate to that. And for listeners who might be new to the aviation world, NAFI is the National Association of Flight Instructors.
Mm-hmm.
And I bet you were a really great teacher. I bet you were like fun, but I don't know, not serious, but fun, but you had purpose and what's the word I'm looking for? Discipline. Is that right? Like, what were you like as a CFI?
I think amazing is what you were searching for.
Amazing was the word I was searching for, but it's too vague. We have to explain your genius and your brilliance.
Right. Well, some kind of brilliance can't be explained. I don't know. I like to think I was good at it. I had plenty of students, and hopefully they would say that it was a great learning experience for them. I have seen a lot of them become extremely successful in their aviation career. Some of them did it for fun, and they still fly too. So luckily, I think I've gotten just about everybody through that needed to be. And it's kind of hard to rate your own proficiency as an instructor, but I haven't gotten too many complaints, so I'm pleased to say that.
Well, I know you talked a lot about the struggles you had, though, with the flight instructor training itself. And that's what we're really dialing into today. And that's why we brought in Nate Ehlers, because you've talked about these massive binders you had to create, and we'll get to all that in the interview. But the path itself, just to get the flight instructor rating, is full of so many hurdles. So we decided to invite Nate Ehlers in. I know you actually connected with him back through the National Association of Flight Instructors. But just to give you guys a little background on our guest today, Nate is kind of an amazing pilot. He's the founder of Backseat Pilot, which is why he's here today. It's a business where the lesson plans have been trusted by over 30,000 flight instructors worldwide. So Nate is a certified flight instructor. He's a United Airlines pilot. Oh, and by the way, also a C-17 instructor pilot in the Air Force Reserve. Yeah, cue the Top Gun music. So he's logged more than 8,000 flight hours across general aviation, regional airlines, military, major airline operations. So he's got all of those pipelines covered from that teacher perspective, civilian, regional, military, and airline. So he has that really unique full spectrum perspective on pilot development that you were talking about, John, where there's so many different avenues, and it seems like in all of them, it involves teaching at some point in some way. So the problem that Nate really saw was that CFIs were burning hundreds of hours and hundreds of unpaid hours rewriting lesson plans before their CFI check rides. So he transformed his own curriculum and his own check rides into this whole business called the Backseat Pilot, where he is giving you access to not only flight plans, but also to standardization of training. And it's a scalable platform where you can really go in and feel like you have all the resources you need as a flight instructor in training so that you can do the work of learning how to teach instead of reinventing the wheel of the curriculum itself. He's going to talk much, much more about it, but I think it's fantastic. And there is one of those aviation buzzwords that came up a lot in the discussion, and I want John to define that for you guys, because I know some of you might be newbies like me. It's FOI. You're going to hear him rattle off FOI, FOI, FOI. What is the FOI? What is that?
Yeah, so the FOI stands for the Fundamentals of Instruction. And so the Fundamentals of Instruction is actually a advisory circular or a book that the FAA has come out with. And it is what we like to call the soft skills of teaching or flight instructing. It's things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and understanding communication. How do I know that the message I'm sending out is being properly received by the student? It also talks about ways of constructing these lesson plans that we're going to talk extensively about. And it gives you sort of a blueprint on how to create those and what that's supposed to look like. Now, the problem is it's a great book. A lot of people don't really take it for as useful as it is until after the fact. It's one of the many things of like, boy, I really wish I had known this when I started. And one of those things is I really wish I had poured deeper into the FOI. It is covered as one of the 2 written tests that flight instructors have to pass before they can earn their certification. But for so many of us, it is one of those tests where you study, you take it, and then you forget about it. And then a little bit later, you realize how important it actually was and go back and start reading it again. It's a great book. I think the biggest trouble that it has is it is a relatively thin book. When we're talking about all of these soft skills and all of these different hats that flight instructors have to wear, to have it covered on, a book maybe as thick as your thumb, it's just not enough space. So I think that when we get into these discussions of what could be covered better for flight instructors, it is that book that could be expanded probably 3 times and still give you not enough information.
Wow, really interesting. I love learning about all of this stuff. So I think you guys talk about the FOIs a little bit in the interview, and I certainly have some questions. As always, John and I are going to meet you after the interview. I have a few questions for you, John, as a flight instructor about the FOI and about, just your top advice that you would give people who are considering this as a career or part of their career, or even just curious if it might be like a retirement sort of side hustle kind of thing. So John and I will meet you at the other end of the interview to talk about all of that. Oh, you're also going to get a little information on an amazing discount that Nate is offering our listeners on all of his products. I've had a chance to preview those. Phenomenal. Talk about that at the end. So lots of reasons. Listen to the whole interview. We'll see you on the other side and enjoy this interview with Nate.
Nate Ehlers, welcome to the Calm Cockpit.
Thank you. Awesome to be here.
We're so happy to have you. And it's funny, I actually have a story that we talked about when we did some of the pre-show meetings that I'll get into about how we met years and years ago, sort of virtually. But before I get into that, you are the founder of Backseat Pilot. Let's talk a little bit about the company. What do you do and how did it start?
Absolutely. I'll try to keep what could be a very long story somewhat manageable, but the company has grown into kind of a CFI prep focus where the goal is to make the path to CFI easier, more manageable. Definitely not easy because it's not an easy rating to get and it shouldn't be. But the whole goal is just to do what we can to make the path smoother and the candidates' confidence higher. And it goes back quite a bit to when I was first instructing. I was out in Long Beach. I was on the downwind with one of my students. The radios went dead. Couldn't talk to anyone. Couldn't hear anyone. We were the only ones in the pattern. Ended up looking over to the tower. We got a green light, landed, and called it a day. Coming to find out, the tower's radios went out. They had an issue. Light signal was simple and easy, but I started thinking, when was the last time I looked at these light gun signals? And if I got a flashing light or a different light, green's the easy one. But if I got a different one, would I have been 100% sure what it meant? So I made a little reference for my knee board and put the light gun signals on there just so I didn't have to worry anymore. And then that kind of grew to other things that are tough to remember, things you just don't use often or, stuff you really need at different times in the airplane. And I built a little reference card. And especially back then, flight instructing was a bit inconsistent. The pay was even less than it is now. Yeah. And so the goal was I could hopefully, turn this into a little product that could make the grocery budget a little more bearable, make life a little easier, make a couple $100 extra and smooth things over. So I built this reference card, got it all printed, and that's where the name came from, the Backseat Pilot. It was supposed to be your little helper in the airplane. If you ever needed it, you could pull it out, find that critical information, the stuff that's tough to remember, etc., and go from there. So I put that on the website, and I put the CFI lesson plans I wrote on the website as well, not really thinking that this was an industry or, something that people needed, just as a way to drive traffic and help the business. The reference card is still part of the company, but the core ended up being those lesson plans. So by throwing those on there to generate extra interest and as a side idea, that turned out to be high demand and something people needed and wanted, and having a core foundation of lesson plans they could edit to take to their CFI check ride. So that's where it kind of all started, and it's just slowly grown and iterated from there into what it is now.
That's awesome. And you're absolutely right. I mean, back in the day, there was not a whole lot of that going on. I mean, that was in a time where knee boards didn't have any information on it like they do now. And you were kind of left to your wits and your intelligence. And in my case, sometimes that can be a little bit difficult. So it's funny. I've been a fan of what you've been doing. Basically, I don't want to say since the beginning, but I feel it was pretty close. And I don't even know how I came across you, but I was still working at NAFI at the time, and I was flight instructing for a 141 university. Somehow I came across either what you were doing, or maybe I even bought a reference card. Maybe that's how it is. In fact, if I can find it, I will post that on social media for this episode because it'll be one of your original ones. I sent a message to you, not expecting to get any kind of response. Some of it was for me, and some of it was because when you work for NAFI, you sort of reach out to anybody who is in that sort of educational realm. And lo and behold, you got back to me, and we ended up having a few chats. And granted, this was like 12, 13 years ago, at least. It never materialized into much of a partnership, unfortunately, but it's just kind of cool that all this time later, here you are, and you're talking to us on a podcast. It's just kind of fun.
I love a good full circle moment. I love those.
Absolutely. That's what I was just going to say. It all came full circle. And I remember getting those emails and talking to you, and then you put me in touch with another gentleman at NAFI, and it was very close to the beginning. Within 2 years for sure, probably even less than that, year and a half or so of starting Backseat Pilot. The reason things kind of didn't work out was because I was going to the Air Force right then.
Oh.
So I did everything backward. I took kind of a weird path through aviation, where I started the civilian route, got my CFI, instructed for a while. I got to the regional airline and then went to the Air Force. Kind of another long story I'll try to keep short. Joined as a reservist. So I got to keep the airline job, but this was right at the beginning of Backseat Pilot. Left for basic, left for pilot training with the Air Force, and that made things difficult to keep up with.
Well, I just remember I had your card on my knee board for years. So your mission of making things easier for CFIs, it definitely helped me out. So if it helped me, I'm sure it helped many others.
Awesome. Thank you. It's still on the website too. That's still the original Backseat Pilot. Made a few changes, updated a little information. It looks a little different, but basically the same concept is still there.
Well, I'm a private pilot candidate, prepping for my first check ride. So I have made a note to get myself that document and add it to the knee board, because I'm thinking, light gun signals. Yeah, beyond green, I think I might be a little hard pressed to really pull those out of my brain, especially in like a pressure moment. So I'm going to get that. Thank you for that tip.
I mean, I don't think any of us actually remember light gun signals. Let's be honest, pilots.
Green for go. Green is go.
There's a reason why we need these kinds of reminders, because I don't know how well I would do right now if you asked me all of them. So the overall theme that we had talked about for this episode is kind of taking the ideas that you used to create Backseat Pilot and the mission that you said of making the path to CFI easier. Let's talk about that a little bit, because for anybody who has either accomplished that path or is on that path right now, it is not easy. And like you said, it probably shouldn't be easy, because if you're going to be teaching people to, fly and have this amazing pastime, which can also be significantly dangerous, it needs to be a little bit tricky. It needs to be a little bit stressful. You need to kind of weed out some of those that aren't doing it for the right reasons. But for those that remain, like, how do we make this path to CFI easier? Because it's probably one of the hardest check rides you'll ever take, but maybe one of the most rewarding ones too.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it is both of those. It's the hardest. It goes a different direction from all the check rides you've taken, where you've just had to prove that you can do the maneuvers. I can fly well. And now you've got to fly well while explaining it and be able to teach on the ground. So it introduces new concepts. It kind of puts you in a new position where you're now guiding the next generation of flyers coming up behind you. So it's, definitely very important and very rewarding. So there are a handful of ways I think we can work to make this easier. The biggest one was the lessons. Going through, it was commonplace and just kind of set tradition that you rewrite your own lessons. Everyone who goes to a CFI check ride, you write your own lessons based on PTS when I did it to ACS now, and you got a lesson for every task in there. And that is a lot of work. I spent months getting through all those. At least 2, if not 2.5 months, writing the CFI lesson plans and, pulling information from the flying handbook, the pilot's handbook, aeronautical knowledge, the FARs. You've got all these resources. You got to find the information, put it together, get them in a logical order. And for me, particularly, that's not the way I learn. So that was more of, I've got to check all these boxes. I've got to build these lessons. And right now it's just compiling information. It's not ingesting it. When I started learning was when I started teaching and going through the information, trying to teach it, and then realizing, hey, that doesn't make sense, or this is missing, or I don't need this. And then I reorganize it. That's what really set it in for me. So step 1 was just getting rid of that reinventing the wheel. No reason to reinvent the wheel every time. Save 2+ months writing your own lessons and get right into the teaching and building the knowledge. And then from there, not only does that accelerate your CFI timeline, but that gets you started teaching earlier, that gets money in your pocket earlier, and that potentially gets you to the airline earlier. And seniority is everything there, or whatever your goal is. So a big step is just having a foundation of lessons to teach from and then going from there. And outside of Backseat Pilot, there are a handful of other companies who do it too. So there are options out there, but getting that core and then having a plan. One of the biggest issues I see from people who reach out are just not having structure. The CFI kind of gives them the ACS and says, good luck, figure it out. This is what you need to know. And you look at that book and you page through and you page and you page and you page. And like you got these lists of tasks and elements and sub elements and risk management and skills. And it's overwhelming. And it's not designed really in a logical order per se of how you'd teach a student or how you'd go through this. And so you can go through the ACS one step at a time, but having a plan, starting with the core, the fundamentals of instruction, understanding those, what they mean, going through the aviation instructor's handbook is a great step 1. It builds the foundation of 1, this is how you teach. 2, this is all the new knowledge that you haven't necessarily learned through private instrument commercial. And then 3, it kind of puts you on a path for how to apply the knowledge in the future lessons. So the FOIs are the big starting point. And then step 2, I like to kind of treat it as a syllabus for a CFI, treat it as we're going to do the ground school first. And so I'll go through the ground lessons in the order of generally what you teach a private or commercial student. Maybe start with systems and aerodynamics and then move into the airport and then into the basics through there. But run through the ground program or ground lessons, if you will, and then move to the flight maneuvers. So you've kind of got segmented, structured portions or a path through the CFI concepts and knowledge and teaching. And then once you get through those, when you start working on the flight maneuvers, then you can start working into pre and post flight briefings, because those are just as important as the material, explaining what you're going to do, what you're going to go through, having a risk management plan for the day, running through the PAVE checklist or whichever you like to use. And then after the lesson, being able to relay the information to the students so they know what they did well, what they can do better, and what's coming next. And that keeps the motivation up. They see the path, they see where they're going, and then moving from that. If you've got a CFI, you got people you're working with, you can go into kind of ad hoc lessons where you say, hey, you're going to sit down with a buddy or CFI and just ask questions, because you're going to get the random questions from students that you didn't plan for, that you don't have a lesson plan for. And so if you can build a path to work through, it gives you the structure, it makes things more manageable, and it keeps the ball rolling. You have direction going through. So hopefully that helps a little bit on at least providing a foundation to get things started.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot in what you just said, and I want to back up a little bit because I could not agree with you more. I mean, I spent so much time making lesson plans, and I think Geeta saw my old CFI binder because it's the rite of passage, right? And mine's like 3 inches thick. It took me like 6 months to make, and you're right. I don't think I learned anything by doing that. I mean, you get through and people pass, and I had a decent pass rate, but could I have done better with the help of somebody who knows what they're talking about? Absolutely. And so often we get stuck in this notion that everybody has to push the same ball up the hill because, well, I had to do it, you have to do it, instead of saying, hey, I pushed it 2/3 of the way up the hill. The next person can push it the next third of the way up the hill, and we all get better as a collective. It's just that I like that concept because I think that we just forget that there's a difference between knowing how to teach and creating these things for the sake of creating them.
But when you say that both of you, I hear you both saying, didn't really get a lot of benefit out of doing it, like as an educator, as a lifelong educator, hang on, second generation educator. That like makes my toes curl and my hair stand on end, because I'm thinking as a music educator, as a yoga educator, we're trained in the primary lesson plan for the formats of our classes. Like we're trained so we know that structure like the back of our hands, so that when a student comes in, we have the flexibility to move with where the student is at and titrate that lesson plan to meet what they need. I wasn't trained to sit in a room and come up with a bunch of lesson plans that have never been used. That just seems like a mismatch of trying to we have all this regulatory knowledge that we need to have, and then we have all the skill knowledge that we need to have. And someone along the line somewhere decided that making CFIs do a bunch of lesson plans was going to bridge that gap. But no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. So the way that, educators are trained, speaking as a lifelong educator and teaching college, is when I went in to teach my first college course, they handed me the syllabus from the previous instructor. And they said, make it your own, but it was already there and the lesson plans were there. So there's an educational mismatch, what I hear as an educator. So I love what you're doing, and CFIs out there listening, please take advantage of these resources. Don't waste your summer like John did when his friends were having a great time and he sat inside in his little apartment doing this book that then he never really used.
Yep.
It seems like it's a real mismatch from how the educational model works out for colleges and for high school and elementary school. So interesting to hear this perspective.
I say this in jest, and it's not to bash the FAA or any of the things that they come up with, but we are trained in lesson plans via 5 pages in the FOI, and it breaks down the 8 sections of a lesson plan. That's how we learn. So companies like the Backseat Pilot and educational materials like that, I mean, it helps so much.
Yeah. And it's tough with, they take what people do in a 4-year college degree and they put it into a book this thick, and that's your teaching credential, for lack of a better word. And so it is,
right.
It's a lot of information that you're just kind of skimming the top of and then trying to apply while you're a flight instructor. So there are ways to try to make it easier. And building off that, I think the FOIs are the most difficult part because they're so new and they're so foreign, and it is just a crash course in learning to teach. And so that's been my focus lately, of trying to come up with ways to make the FOIs more digestible, understandable, and then applicable, because it's so easy to read through the aviation instructor's handbook and look at the ACS requirements and say, oh, I got to know the laws and characteristics of learning. I got to know, the dimensions, or I've got these acronyms, my REAPER and RUAC and PERMA for making the laws and characteristics and all. And I memorized those, but I don't really understand them. I don't know how to apply them. So that's kind of been the focus now, building an FOI study tool where we go through each section of the ACS and of the lesson plans I've written. And, there's slides on it to explain the topics. And these are the topics. This is application focused information. And then a section where you can actually listen to it being taught. So you can hear someone explaining these to a student. And then the next was quiz questions. So kind of trying to move toward the FOI knowledge test, that kind of structure, and then just understanding the knowledge, and then moving from the quiz questions into the system is set up where you can teach the concepts verbally to the computer. It'll record the whole thing, look at the transcript and say, hey, you hit these topics, you missed this one, and you can restructure it this way, or you can talk about it like this, or add an example, and that'll help a ton. And then scenario questions that are the same way. So it's really, I think there are a lot of tools there to strengthen and make the FOI concepts a lot more digestible and applicable. And then if that foundation's really strong, I think it makes teaching everything else a lot easier and gets the ball rolling a lot faster.
I know things have changed now, but back in the day when I was creating that big, thick binder, and at one point or another, I either broke down or just wanted a comparison, and I found a group of lesson plans from somewhere, and I don't know if I was going to, at the time, try to pass them off as my own, or if I was going to compare and contrast what I came up with what this other person had come up with and see if I was on the right track. But there was a lot of stigma back then about not creating your own. And, I think a lot of that has gone away now. But when you first started out and you started creating things like this, was there pushback from sort of the typical instructors who thought of this as a rite of passage?
A bit, yeah, there was. Not so much directly, more indirect. The people who would buy them or use them obviously were interested in it. Where I tended to see it was people reaching out and saying, is my examiner going to know these are Backseat Pilot? How do I make sure he doesn't know? Because I don't want to get in trouble. And then, even the aviation instructor's handbook says you can use commercial third-party lessons. Just make sure you know them and make sure you can teach from them. You're not just reading a script. It has changed and evolved over time. I don't get that question much anymore. And even there are a lot of DPEs I talk to and work with who support and promote using these third-party lessons and just making them your own, because it does make everyone's life easier. And so over time, it has definitely decreased. Every once in a while, I still see something online in the chat room where, no, you got to make your own. Or I get an email from a client who says, my instructor said I have to make my own. I can't use these. And it's like, that's a tough one, because it's your training and you're paying for it. So I understand there's a give and a take there. So that's definitely a tough one. But yes, in a roundabout way, get back to your question. Yes, it existed more. It has definitely died down over the years.
Well, and the benefit, I think, for people, and this is where I kind of settled on at the time, was even if you're using someone else's material, like you said, you have to know the material. Just because it's an outline is written on paper doesn't mean that you can explain the outline or teach the concepts that are within said outline. So I think in terms of the making the path to a CFI easier, I think one of the things that does help with is it gives me, the instructor or the soon to be instructor, a path of saying, okay, these are the things I need to study so that I can teach this lesson plan, versus going, I'm staring at a blank piece of paper. I don't know what's supposed to be on it. How do I study when I don't know what I'm supposed to know? And so I think that is where a huge part of that value is it gives me the outline of where I need to better myself so that I can better you.
Yeah, absolutely. Having the structure and the foundation and it just it takes the weight off your shoulders. It makes less work, less stress. You've got at least a foundation in a direction, and then you can dig into the ACS requirements, the document, compare the two, and make the changes. And that was one of the biggest points of interest, I guess, I got from DPEs near the beginning, was there are students who will take these and they come to the check ride and just read them. And that's not teaching, and that's not going to work. And they were saying, hey, just be more vocal about making sure they know they've got to be able to teach it and they've got to make it their own. And that's very fair and exactly what it should be.
One of the other things I wanted to talk to you about, because I think there's a little bit of a misnomer as to the difference, and maybe you can kind of shed some light on this. A lesson plan versus a curriculum. What's the difference? How does that all come together?
Yeah. kind of look at curriculum and syllabi as the big picture, the overarching umbrella that contains everything. A curriculum can take you from beginning to end, and a syllabus can knock out specific sections. And these can vary a bit, but professional pilot curriculum, where I'm going to take you from 0 hours to CFI and on that track to professional pilot. And then the syllabi in there can break down each of the ratings. So I'll have a private pilot syllabus, an instrument, a commercial multi-engine CFI syllabus. And then from there, the lesson plans are the day-to-day outline of what you're going to do to accomplish the syllabus, to accomplish the curriculum, and kind of build through there. And that's where things are there's a mismatch between kind of the CFI lesson plans you build for your check ride and the lesson plans you use in real life to teach a student. Because the CFI lesson plans for the check ride are built to follow the ACS. So you've got the fundamentals of instruction section, and then you've got technical subject areas, and you continue on through there through maneuvers and airport operations and emergencies and all. It doesn't follow necessarily a logical order. Each lesson doesn't tie to a specific lesson you'd teach a private or commercial student. Some do, some don't. It's not exactly a one-to-one there. So you build your CFI lesson plans for the check ride. And then when you go to teach the students, you can teach from them, but at times you're kind of teaching from one or two different lesson plans. So there's a little disconnect there. And what I've tried to do to bridge that gap, especially because you put so much time and effort into customizing these lessons and making them yours, and you don't want to rewrite another set for each rating. We've already spent the time on that, is I built syllabi for each of the ratings: private instrument, commercial, multi-add-on, and CFI. And those syllabi take the CFI lesson plans or instructor lesson plans and apply them to each lesson. So in lesson 1, it's aerodynamics for the most part and some risk management. So it says, hey, grab your CFI aerodynamics lesson plan and PowerPoint and grab the risk management. And risk management, we're only going to do, sections 1 and 2 because we're still early in the syllabus. So kind of developed a way to not reinvent the wheel over again and use the work you've done to teach the students. Now, of course, generally your flight school will have syllabi and they've got their own structure. And so you'll end up using that. So this is more for the independent instructor or for the student who just likes to build that mental model and understand how the information all ties together and how it applies going forward. Just that different kind of learning style. Hopefully that was a lot of information to answer your question of curriculum, syllabus, lesson plan.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm sort of getting to is just the general concept that we walk out of CFI training and we've got all these lesson plans and we think as instructors and as pilots that we have a syllabus. It's kind of like, what is it? All jacuzzis are whirlpools, but not all whirlpools are jacuzzis. A curriculum is a collection of lesson plans, but not all collections of lesson plans are syllabuses, right? You can't just say, oh, I've got these and they're going to immediately be the right thing to bring somebody from point A to point B.
Yeah, you got to put them in the right order, organize it. The syllabus follows the building block concepts of it takes you from block 1, builds the foundation, and then builds the next layer, and it keeps building on the information as you reach the point of the pyramid and, whatever rating that is or your goal. And then the lesson is the way to apply or build that information on a daily basis.
I'm loving this because I feel like so much of the stress that comes when we're learning something new is exactly what you said. We don't have a mental model for how it all fits together, and then ways to move the information that's coming in under that mental model depending on what situation we find ourselves in. And I feel like, as you've pointed out, the ACS is great. All the information is in there, but it's not always presented in the way that we're experiencing it in our lives. So I can just notice a lot, like in my midlife pilot groups and that a lot of times the stress is around the volume of information and the uncertainty, maybe I'm speaking for myself here, of where to put that in the mental model. So the fact that you're saying that you have developed and that we can beg, borrow, and steal from you, these mental models for how these work though, and then take the building blocks of information and feed them under the different categories, I think that would give a CFI a really robust understanding of how all of the systems work together, but also that sort of authority over the information so that they're not just copying and pasting information, but they actually have built in their own head a model for how it all works, which to my point, I'm just bringing it back to that brings stress reduction because then you no longer have this question in your mind of why am I doing 8,000 more lesson plans? Why am I doing this? Why am I just trudging through knocking off these requirements? I don't see how I'm actually going to be able to do it with the student. And what I hear you saying is step back from all of that, put it in a real world scenario that's a mental model, and then move the modules around accordingly to your own life. That's real command of the material. So that makes me feel less stressed even for my own check ride of thinking about things in that way. And I think that often gets missed. We look at the stressed out student who's in front of us and we just try to fix in the moment like what they're stressed about. But sometimes I think the way that the aviation curriculum is set up, from my point of view as an educator, promotes the stress because we're trying to teach to the ACS, but that's fundamentally disconnected from how we learn as human beings. So I think you're addressing a stress reduction component there too, which is a good thing.
Yeah, those can be helpful, especially through CFI. We
Yeah.
can need a combined CFI/yoga path to getting this all done.
Just take a deep breath and go, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So Nate, let's take a step back and kind of tweak that point from Geeta a little bit. Knowing what we know as instructors and what you know through all of your backseat pilot stuff, let's put your student pilot hat on for a second. When I was with NAFI, one of the things we would get is students who would call in or prospective students who would call in and ask like, okay, well, what makes a good instructor or a good flight school? Like what kind of red flags should I be looking for in terms of, how to find the right place? Because let's face it, it's a lot of money. You don't want to sink, say, $10,000 into something that's not going to provide you quality training. But as a student, you've got no idea what you're getting into. We used to talk about the whole idea of, okay, make sure that the instructor or the school that you're going to does have a curriculum and it's okay to ask to look at those lesson plans. You may not know what's on them, but you can the average person can even look at that and see structure to it. And that there's a red flag if you do come across an instructor who just goes, I don't know. I just we'll just start from the beginning and we'll see how it happens. So knowing what you know with a student pilot hat on, what would be your answer to that? What makes a good instructor? What makes a good instructor who has a curriculum? Like, how do you find the value and the person who's above everybody else in terms of the product?
Yeah. That's a great question. And it's so important because it is a lot of money and you don't know what you're not learning. So if you end up with a bad instructor and they take you through everything, you get to the check ride and things go terribly and you didn't know what you needed to know. So yeah, it's tough because it's a whole new world of information and procedures. So you start at the bottom, start with reviews, get information from people who've been there and gone through it. And that'll at least provide a foundation, a core to start building on to at least narrow down the schools, which ones are getting the good reviews and are putting out good pilots. And, even going from there into Reddit and places like that, you can get really good information that's generally very honest, really good information and great advice. From there, when you go start talking to the schools, that's the hardest part because it's so new and different and you don't know what to look for because it's unfamiliar. So yes, looking at the lesson plans, looking at the school as a whole, I think you kind of have to take a holistic view to an extent because the detail is tough to snuff out to someone who hasn't done it before. So if the school appears well put together, taken care of, orderly and structured, I think generally those big picture concepts applied to the flight school tend to work their way into the syllabi, into the training, and into the aircraft maintenance. So ensuring that you see the structure, they've got a plan. They're not just saying, oh, you want a private? It's probably 12, 15 grand. We'll figure it out. It's 40 hours is the minimum and minimum means minimum. It rarely does anyone ever hit that. So it ends up being 60 to 75. And if they can walk you through it, explain the concepts, explain the costs, how they've built the program, why they do what they do. I think the why is the big one as well. Understanding why we do things in a certain order, why we're going to plan for 65 hours instead of 40 and just try to get you in the door and get you flying. Why we take care of the planes the way we do and, the procedures we use and the system they built for the school.
It's good advice. It is. And I always used to tell people it is okay to interview your instructor. Right? Like they're interviewing for a job because they're providing this service to you. The least you can do for your own benefit is to get to know the way that they communicate, the structure that they have, their skills in teaching different ways. You might learn more graphically than verbally. And, do they have the infrastructure in place for that? Hands-on, whatever that looks like. And so it's so important for students to know that you can ask those questions. You can even ask for a sample lesson to see how they can communicate to you. And that's extremely important.
Yeah. Making sure you click with the instructor too, because personality styles exist, and making sure you want to be around them for a number of hours in a small space, loud, small space that can be hot and uncomfortable and bumpy. And then doing the intro flight. Once you've narrowed it down from the schools to talk to, you talk to a few and you say, I think I like these two the best. That intro flight's usually the least expensive way to dip your toe in the water and see how they actually communicate in the plane and what comes next, and get a better feel for how things work. So kind of taking it step by step, and definitely understanding the CFI, like you said, and interviewing them, because you're basically paying them to work for you.
It's an interesting dynamic, though, because you are paying for them. But then at the same time, as a student pilot, like I'm 100% dependent on my CFI to sneeze. I'm like, can I get an endorsement? I have to sneeze. So it's an interesting dynamic that I have to continually remind myself that to both be the humble student, but then also self-advocate. So that's tricky, especially when it's so new and your sense of safety is riding on this individual, because I didn't know how to land an airplane in my discovery flight, So that's an interesting psychological bridges that you cross, especially I think for private pilot. But yeah, clicking is important. And right, the cleanliness of the place, the orderliness of it says a lot. It really does. Like if their garbage is overflowing and the ropes are laying on the floor, you can kind of get the vibe for how they keep the space is usually how the rest of it's going to flow. CFIs everywhere are vacuuming quickly now.
So shifting gears here, one of the notes that I wrote from our pre-show interview here was highlighting the idea of what CFIs don't learn in training. Let's talk about this. What are some of the important things that CFIs use, or good ones do, that they don't generally or typically learn while they're training to be CFIs?
So much of what you learn comes right after you get the rating. I remember thinking the same thing. About 6 months after that, you're like, I learned more in these last, even 3 months, in the last 3 months from getting my CFI than I learned in all the training before that. And a lot of that just comes from students asking you questions, and questions you didn't think of or perspectives you didn't take. And you're like, oh, I never thought about it that way, or I didn't even realize that. Kind of getting back to things you don't know. And I think the FOIs are kind of the core of that right now, from what I see, is where we memorize the things we need to know in the FOIs and know what to say to get us through the check ride, to where if we're talking about the laws of learning or the characteristics of learning, we can say the acronym, we can list them off, and then we dig a little deeper, and I know what effect is. I know what primacy is. I've got to teach it the right way first. It's like, all right, I said the highlighted item and now I can move on. But then you start looking at them as a whole and how it all works together, and then how to apply that outside of just teaching it right the first time. And I know this is a little bit of a vague answer. It's a lot more to it than that, but there's so much more to the FOI concepts than I think we give them credit for. And part of that is because it's just a little book you get and you said, hey, memorize this, get the information you need, and then go teach, and let's get the ball rolling so I can start instructing. Outside of that, learning how much to talk, when not to talk, how much to talk. That's one that takes a little bit of learn by doing. And you can do it for a while with your instructor, but at the same time, when you get a student in different stages of their training, knowing when to talk and when to shut up and when to let them make the error versus fix it for them is a big one. And I think that one does a lot for the student as well. Because if you're constantly fixing errors and constantly propping them up, being their helping hand, they never learn to do that on their own. So when they get out in the plane on their own, now they run into an issue and they look to you and you're not there and they're stuck. So there's a balance of letting them go down the rabbit hole and letting them try to find their way out of it before things get unsafe. And then if things start getting unsafe, that's when you step in and say, okay, you're getting outside, or you're getting to the edges of my bubble, my safety bubble. Now let's pull it back in. We'll talk about this and we'll build from there. But that's one of the biggest ones, I think, is finding the limits of the bubble, knowing when to let them make mistakes, when to help them and kind of show them that a mistake is starting to occur, and fine tuning that throughout the stages of training and the different people you work with.
One of my favorite things, and you have to be careful because it can be overused and become predictable, but the value of the simple phrase, "Are you sure?" Because, and using it correctly, because you can't always say that when you know they're wrong. You have to say it when you know they're right too. But Geeta, what are the different forms of drag? And you repeat off parasite and all of the things. And I just sit there quietly and look you in the eyes and say, "You sure?" And the answers that people sometimes come up with, because they got the answer right, but then they start digging, like, why would he ask me that? I must be missing something. Oh. So you have to be careful how you use it, but it can be just a very powerful tool to actually see if somebody is confident in what they're talking about, or if it gives them a clue of like, maybe you might be missing something. I don't know. Geeta, does your instructor do that to you at all?
Yes, it happened to me yesterday. That's why I'm laughing. We were doing a ground school like mock check ride, I think on just like task A and B. I forget what the question even was, but there was a long pause and there was just a which is his version of, are you sure? And it turns out I was right, but I was doubting myself because I'm at that point of like prepping for the check ride. And he wanted to like, for me to prove to myself and to him that I wasn't just, to your point, Nate, rattling off the answer, but that I actually knew it and understood the difference between and or in that sentence and how it applied to the regulation. Yeah. Does it all the time. And now it's a mind game because I never know if he's, in the beginning, it was always like, you're wrong and giving me some leeway. But now it's like, I need you to show little Miss PIC. Are you actually right or are you actually wrong? And what are you going to do with this? So yeah, it's good though, because it keeps us on our toes for sure. I feel this pain acutely.
So Nate, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, what does AI do for your curriculum, your lesson plans, the products that you provide? Like, where do you see AI currently in the instructional space? But then also, do you have any sort of predictions as to where that's going to go and how it's going to further improve how we as instructors operate?
Because we're going to record this in 5 years. We're going to have you back, Nate, and we're going to see if your predictions were accurate.
You can have my AI CFI back by then. I won't even need to teach anymore the way this is going.
A Nate bot in the
exactly. So what I've started with initially, and this is kind of feeling out to see what makes sense and where it can best be used. I think it's a good way to supplement and get the student thinking and verbalizing and interacting with the material early so that when they show up to the instructor, they are just more familiar with it, more confident with it, understand it better. In no way do I see it replacing an instructor in anytime soon. But
that's good.
Like you said, I might be eating my words in a few years. So what I've done initially with the FOI concepts, and this is kind of the test phase, and then see how that works, see how people like it, and then try to expand it through the rest of the ACS topics, is primarily the teach phase, the scenarios, and then a kind of a mock check ride, mock oral portion. So for the CFI lesson plans, they're broken into sections organized by logical groupings of requirements. So CFI task 1B, I think, is learning process. I think it's got a handful of sections, but each section then has an AI option in the new tool I'm building where you can teach the concepts. It'll analyze what you said, what you got right, what you got wrong, what you missed. It'll look for filler words. It'll look at spacing, timing, how quick you're talking, long pauses. And over time, you can even bring this in to look at voice tone and excitement and, versus monotone teaching. So there's a lot of ways to look at not only the information, but the way you're saying it and how you're saying it. So it gets the student thinking early about, I need to slow down. Like, I'm talking really fast, which the speed I'm talking right now, it'd be like, hey, this is way too fast. Conversational pacing is much too fast for teaching. So you really got to slow down, explain things slowly and clearly, make sure you're talking through the information. And these are the concepts you want to teach. These are the points we're going to hit. Make sure we're on the right track here. And then try to make sure it's in a logical order. From there, the scenarios are very similar, making sure if we create the scenario, speak out loud, talk to the AI like you would a student or like you would an examiner, and it can record everything, assess it, give you feedback on what was good, what was bad, where you can improve. And then the newest one that I just kind of got version 1 working last week is the mock check ride. So at the end of every ACS task, 1B learning process, I've got a mock check ride built now where the AI will introduce itself, say, hey, these are the 5 topics we're going to talk about from task 1B. And I'm going to ask you a knowledge portion and a scenario portion about it. And it'll say, okay, tell me about whatever knowledge portion. I can't think of them off the top of my head right now for the learning process. And it says, okay, if you get it right, if you nail it and it's a good answer, it'll say, awesome, let's continue. Now let's put it into a scenario. If you get it wrong, it'll dig deeper like a DPE would. Or if you don't get all the answers, it'll say, okay, hold on. Now you got 2 of them, but tell me about the other couple. And then it'll say, okay, let's take that and put it in a scenario. You've got a student who's struggling with this situation. You haven't been able to get through to them. How do you apply this concept to that student? And it does a surprisingly good job. It's conversational in that you can talk to it like you would a DPE and it talks back to you. It's the
Wow.
beginning stages of building confidence and kind of getting the brain, the wheels turning earlier than they otherwise would have, so that when you do it with a CFI, you're more confident. You've been through this before. And it's currently, so right now it's just based on the FOI concept, section 1 of the ACS, and it pulls the information from the ACS. So you turn the ACS PDFs into a format the AI and the code can use. You put it in there, you give it a bunch of data that ties to each concept. I'll try to make this as simple as possible. But basically, there's a bunch of backend data that supports every chunk of the aviation instructor's handbook. So when you ask a question or it wants to discuss a topic, it pulls the information from the aviation instructor's handbook, gets everything it needs, and then says, all right, I'm going to ask you a knowledge question about this, and then we're going to put in a scenario, and then I'm going to grade you at the end. So at the end, my favorite part is it'll actually go through each question with you. Say, question 1, we talked about the laws of learning. You got most of them right, you missed a couple, and then the application, that's where your knowledge was lacking. So you got the knowledge part, but the application could use some work. And here's what I would have done. Here's how I would have said it different. And then it sums it all up in the end. And then it gives you links to go to the training modules I talked about earlier. It says, hey, you struggled with this one. If you go back to lesson 1B, section 2, that's where the slides talk about that information. So you run over there, run through those slides, and hopefully that starts building. But big picture, I think it's a way to get the wheels turning early, to get your brain in the gear it needs to be to start thinking through this, explaining the concepts, because talking them out loud is a huge part of learning to teach, and then being able to get some level of feedback from outside of just staring into a mirror or your friends or family or whoever. I think it's a great way to get a foundation of learning started.
My mind is blown. This is awesome.
It still blows my mind that A, it works, and B, it's possible to do.
And that it's pulling from the accurate resources is, fantastic.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you planning this to be a model for all the different certificates? Like, are you going to go and do it for private and instrument and commercial students as well? Or are you mostly sticking to the CFI, CFII route?
The plan is to start CFI. So kind of get these concepts ironed out. I built a lot of phases: the teach, listen, quiz, the slides, the oral, and then the mock check ride. So it is a lot of tools, I guess. Figure out which ones are most useful, which ones are used the most, which ones aren't. Because I'm sure, talking about the CFI lessons, I'm sure I didn't get it right on the first try. So figure out what people like and don't, and what works and doesn't, and then build it out for the CFI. And then what's great about that is the CFI covers private and commercial knowledge. So everything's already built there. It just takes some tweaking. So now you take the CFI level lesson on takeoffs and landings, and you tweak it for a private pilot who's learning for the first time and a commercial pilot who can dig deeper on the concepts and understand more nuance. And so it kind of builds a big foundation that I can then start pushing out in other directions to, yes, hopefully, assuming the ball keeps rolling, we can keep figuring this out, move into private, instrument, commercial, etc.
Wow.
But that's the goal. It's
awesome.
It's fun. It's exciting. It's new.
I think it's so great too, because you're training the performance of the actual thing, right? Which is sometimes like the missing piece for me. Again, I only have my little baby experience to reflect on, but I can study at home. I can have my husband ask me questions, and then somehow being up in front of a CFI is like another level of pressure. But if I had something like this to practice at home and practice just that concept of literally performing, it's like musicians do. We perform to an empty hall before we put the people in the seats. It's that little gap that we're missing.
The Air Force had a very fun and good way of doing that, where we would do stand-up. And so it was kind of like scenario-based training, but under pressure, so that you do it in the classroom first before you do it in the plane. And man, this was everyone's biggest fear of being in the classroom, is they'd pick you. So we had about 15 in our flight, and they'd pick one person, and you'd have to come up in front of the class. Everyone else is sitting in like a horseshoe shape or a U. You'd stand at the podium at attention. You'd have your handbook, the airplane operating handbook, and your checklists and whatever you needed there. And they'd give you a scenario. The instructors would. They say, all right, we're on our flight yesterday. You're doing a loop. You get to the loop. You get upside down. You get a red light. You have the aircraft. What do you do? And you've got to run through this whole spiel. And you've got to say the right things about what you're going to do. And then you've got to walk through it step by step. Standing up there, you're sweating a little bit. Everyone's watching, and you got to talk through, okay, I see a red light. I'm going to maintain control. So you talk through how you're going to get the airplane back to a safe state. And then I'm going to analyze the situation. Now you got to ask probing questions to figure out what's going on. Okay, I see the red light. Are there any other lights on? Engine indications? Do I smell anything? Do I feel anything? So you dig deeper there. Once you think you have it figured out, say, I'm going to take the proper action. I'm going to run this checklist. And then assuming you're doing the right thing, you're going to land, you're going to find a way to get the airplane on the ground. And if you get it wrong, they give you a hard time. They sit you down. And then you don't fly that day if you get sat down. So it's kind of humiliating, and that hurts your ego a bit. And it's not fun being up there. And then they bring someone else to finish what you messed up, which is always fun too, because then they bring someone else. And now that you're stepped away from the podium, you see so clearly, like, oh, I know exactly what I should have done.
Yeah.
It's amazing how if you just take that one step back, everything clears up. Put someone else up there. They take over where you left off, run down another rabbit hole. Same process, but high stress. They get the wheels turning early, and then it's all done so that when you're in the plane and this happens, it's not a situation of, oh no, panic. No, I've got a structure. I've been not as stressed, but I've been stressed already doing this, and now I can apply that in the airplane.
Everybody wants to be the second try at a Jeopardy question because the first person got reasonably close, and now you can probably answer a little bit better. We have a couple guys at my flight department who are former Air Force guys, and the legend of the stand-up, I have heard it from them as well. And I think Tammy Barlett, one of our former guests, I think she brought it up. So these things haunt you guys. I know they make you better, but I can tell that they sort of haunt you military aviators.
It was stressful, to say the least. Yeah, you did not. Oh man, it was one of those when they're getting ready to pick, like everyone's trying to avoid eye contact with the instructor. And then as soon as they pick you, your heart just drops. You're like, oh man. And you're going to get picked because everyone has to go through it.
Wow.
Just hope you don't get one of the real tough situations.
As we wind this down, I want to bring it back from sort of the futuristic tools to things that we know work well right now. And one of the other things we talked about previously was just the notion of tutoring, the notion of CFIs getting tutoring, just general aviators getting tutoring. And you mentioned this thing called ClassPass. Let's talk a little bit about this. What is it? What's the value? And tell me about why tutoring and sort of educational mentorship is important.
The emails I get from students who just didn't have a path. Their CFI gave them the ACS, said, good luck, you'll figure it out. Those situations where the student just doesn't have enough guidance and structure and doesn't know which direction to go. So the tutoring is intended to really help there and provide that guidance and structure. And then being able to have time just to bounce your questions off a person. So initially we developed the CFI prep course, which is a 4-week course, meets an hour and a half once a week for 4 weeks. Week 1 would be the FOIs. Talk about those 4-year degree, compressing it to the half-inch book, and then compressing it to an hour and a half. So it's definitely not intensive and all-encompassing, but gives them a foundation of these are important ones to focus on. Week 2, they teach a ground lesson and get feedback from the students and the instructor. Week 3 is a flight lesson. Same thing. Week 4 is the ad hoc plus pre and post flight briefings and then mock check ride prep. So that was kind of the initial idea, is getting all these emails, people lacking structure. How do we just provide structure and give them a path to follow that helps support their path with their CFI? And then from there, we transitioned over to the ClassPass, where now the idea is we have a number of classes every week. Right now it's 3. We're talking about changing that and figuring out what works. 3 classes that meet once a week for an hour and a half. One's a CFI, check ride prep. One's CFI and MEI, and kind of switches off between the 2 topics. And then the other was just an office hours. Bring whatever questions you have, whether that's on structure, guidance, building a lesson plan, editing lesson plans, the FARs, a question about teaching, anything. It's just office hours as you're going through your CFI rating. And the idea is just $95 a month. It's up to 18 hours of training every month. Just trying to give students a place to come and get the structure, get the guidance, get the knowledge, ask the questions, and not have to worry about disappointing their flight instructor or, dealing with them. You can just get the information you need and show up a little more prepared next time. We're talking about changing that a little bit. The ClassPass right now, 3 classes, hour and a half each, might be switching to 4 or 5 at an hour each, try to compress things and spread it out a bit. And then we'd try to introduce a post CFI class. So kind of more maybe preparing you for whatever comes after CFI, whether that's interview prep, setting the foundation for how crew concepts work in the airlines or charter operations or turbine kind of jet aircraft operations, how that works. It sounds like that's starting to become more of a check ride topic too for commercial and CFI candidates. And then putting in office hours midweek instead of just on the weekend. So bunch of ideas. And like we talked about earlier, we're just kind of throwing spaghetti at a wall, see what sticks, and then throw some more, see what sticks. And hopefully over time, we've just got a great arsenal of really useful classes that people can show up to if they want, or if they don't, record all of them and throw them on the website. So if they miss it, they can hop on and, you don't get your question directly answered, but you can catch up and still get some check ride prep and brush up on the topics, stay check ride ready.
I love that. It definitely fills in the gap. It proves the notion that sometimes the same question being asked by a different CFI is huge. I used to do that to my students where it would be, we'd go through check ride prep and then I'd say, okay, go talk to somebody else. And it'd be the exact same questions spoken by a different person, maybe with a different inflection. And next thing you know, they're like, I don't know. And we're like, we talked about this. You answered this yesterday. So that way it doesn't happen when they actually go with a DPE who's going to do the same thing. I think that that's huge. I also love the concept of the post CFI thing. When I was with NAF, I did an interview with a gentleman who ran a flight school on the West Coast, and their flight school specialized in what they called CFI finishing school. They had created this entire curriculum for new CFIs to kind of go over some of these things that you're talking about, the things they don't know that they need to know. And then a lot of times that was a gateway into being hired as an instructor by that school. So this concept of all of the things that you can't cram into a check ride, but are still useful as CFIs when you walk up to your first student. And as you pointed out, they ask you a question. You're like, we never talked about this for my training check ride. What do I do? So I just love any extra tools that a CFI can use. And frankly, for those of you out there listening, those of you that are experienced instructors, this applies to you as well, because I don't care how long you've been doing it. A, there's always going to be things you can brush up on. And B, there's always going to be things that somebody's thought of that would be really helpful that maybe you haven't learned, regardless of whether you've been doing it for a year or 10 years. So Nate, I think what you're doing is exceptional. I love it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. The whole idea, try to make the path easier, because we all remember how difficult it was. The mental model I try to use is how can I cut the time to CFI in half, but make the student twice as confident? We cut out, give you the foundational lessons, give you classes, give you people to talk to, hopefully get the ball rolling, talking with the AI and looking at these concepts, and just keep trying to find ways to get you just as confident and just as knowledgeable in less time.
I hope that's on your coffee mug. Twice as confident half the time. Like that should be a t-shirt, a coffee mug on your business cards. I love it.
I'll trademark it tonight. Yeah, that's a great idea.
So if I wanted to learn more about Backseat Pilot, where do I go? How do I find you? Tell us all the social media things. Do a quick plug for yourself.
Yeah, thank you. The backseatpilot.com is the website. And then working on the backseatpilot.ai. That's kind of the next iteration where I'll try to make this all useful. That's a work in progress. Instagram, Facebook, out there. I spend so much time buried in these books that social media is not a strong suit, but I'm working on that. But yeah, you can find the Backseat Pilot on Facebook. You can find it on Instagram, Twitter as well, LinkedIn, all over the place. We'll get better at posting there once the ball gets rolling a little more. But reach out with any questions on the website. There's a contact form, or just reach out to info@thebackseatpilot.com. I read all those. I'll answer all of them. I think I've talked to one person ever who got into aviation because it was a good job. That was quote unquote. It was a good job. Not because they had the passion, not because they wanted to be a pilot since they were little. None of that. They just thought it was a good job. Otherwise, I think 99 point, however many nines you want to throw on that, % of us get in because it's a passion and it's something we love and can't imagine living without. So more than happy to help talk about the civilian way, the military way, offer my help where I can.
I'm going to put all those links in the show notes too. So people just tippity tap your little fingers on down and reach out. You have so much knowledge, all the work that you do in all the facets. It's amazing. I have one wrap up question. Do you sleep ever?
I'm trying to focus a bit more on that because
how I'm worried about your self-care, Nate. I want to make sure you keep going.
He's going to give you a yoga nidra for to go home with.
Yeah, right.
Give you a little guided relaxation just to kind of, we need you to keep doing this for another 20 years. So
I got my first Apple Watch not that long ago. I was late to the party, but it tracks your sleep, which is great in some ways. And also you realize I swore I was getting more sleep than it says I was, but nope, that's something I need to focus on. So that is, I did get a good night's rest last night. So that was great.
Good. Well, you're on
Felt
point
great.
today. It shows.
Well, Nate,
Awesome.
we really appreciate you taking the time to join us on the
Yeah,
show today.
great.
I think that the things that you are working on are admirable and very needed for the industry, and your efforts to make flight instruction easier, more structured, and safer, I think will go a long way. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It was great talking to both of you and great to be on the podcast. And I really appreciate it.
Welcome back, everybody. Geeta and John here for a little post-interview debrief. So much great information in that. And before I forget, I want to say that Nate was super with capital S's all the way across, generous with John and I, and he gave us access to his products. I went through and looked. Of course, I stuck at the private pilot level because that still is enough for me. But the annotation that he has to the Airman Certification Standards, the ACS in there, phenomenal. The lesson plans, amazing. The depth and detail of everything that he has within his business is really indicative of someone who has thought about this, and not only thought about it, but actually put it in the hands of students who are using it and then gone back and refined it. And I feel like that is some of what you were talking about, John, with Nate in the interview, that a lot of it's like you sit alone in a room as a flight instructor candidate and you study this stuff, but then you're not always given as much time like with the actual just teaching and mentorship part of like how you teach a person this stuff. It seems like there's a little bit of a missing piece there. Am I accurate in hearing that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an art form to transmitting the knowledge that you have. I mean, you know this as an educator. I can sit there and I can rattle off facts and I can memorize books and all of these things. But when I'm trying to actually explain something, say aerodynamics to a student, I can't just tell them facts. I can't just say, here is what parasite drag is.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What am I going to remember about this? Why do I need to know it? Why is it important? Those are the soft skills that we keep talking about, where it's translating that information into something that's digestible, rememberable, and actually creates learning in the experience with the student.
Well, you mentioned the FOIs, which we now know is the fundamentals of instruction back in the top of the show, and it came up during the interview. And you were saying how like that slim little book is so important, but not often given the weight it needs. I haven't looked at it, and I'm wondering, in that book, do they give examples or is it just theory about teaching?
Well, I'll admit they've changed it a couple times since I last read it.
Oh, true, right? Yeah. It might be totally different now, right?
Yeah, it could be. It could be different. I'm sure there's some examples in there. It still kind of goes back to, it becomes rote memorization. People read it. They study the test questions from whatever test prep software you use. They learn the test and they take the test. And it's not until that student walks up on day one and they're staring at you like a little baby duckling and all of a sudden they start asking questions and you realize like, I don't know how to answer this, or I don't remember, or any number of things. And then it becomes this on-the-job learning experience, which is always going to happen. We have to accept the fact that an instructor who's never had a student is going to have a lot of on-the-job learning. But that doesn't make you bad. That doesn't make you a ineligible instructor. It just means that there's still some soft skills that need to come to play, and you're not going to realize where your gaps are until you start actually teaching and then finding them on accident. It happens to all of us.
I love that idea, though, of coming back to the FOI, that it's this book and you're kind of like, okay, you know that tool exists and it's there for you and you have it to go back to. And I think great books do that as educators, that when you need it, you go back and you loop around the same material again, but probably with a deeper understanding every time you encounter it. So let's say we have someone listening to the show who's like either a new CFI or thinking about becoming one, or maybe like someone like me who's retired and thinking, yeah, maybe I would teach some ground lessons, like Brian Siskind, or maybe I would eventually maybe even want to do part-time instructing. What are the things that like you wish you knew, or even just encouragement you can give to people? Because sometimes we get so bogged down by all of like the regs and the rules and, checking all the boxes, but zoom out. What's your advice for someone who is curious about all this?
I mean, there's a lot to the becoming an instructor experience. It looks like this overwhelming, immovable object. And to put a cliche there, I mean, you really do have to eat it one bite at a time. That's the only way this elephant is going to be accomplished.
Yeah.
And it's funny because going back to my experience at the National Association of Flight Instructors, this question was the single largest reason why we created what we called the professional development program. The whole notion is what are all the things you wish you knew on day one as an instructor that isn't covered under the actual training curriculum? Because it's not that the curriculum is lacking per se, it's that it's just impossible to cover everything. Flight instructors wear so many different hats. We're pilots, we're instructors. In some cases, we're like psychologists, we're doctors, we're all of these things that you can think of because we have all of these subjects that we have to instruct in. But then at the same time, I'm observing you as an instructor, not just watching your pilot skills. I'm watching your attitude. I'm watching your mannerisms. I'm watching your behavior because I need to know, am I putting you in a situation that's making you uncomfortable? Are you enjoying the experience? Should I pull back? Like there's just a lot of this stuff that is so much beyond the flying experience. And so when I'm looking at telling somebody, okay, you're working on this curriculum, you're starting out, you're going to be a CFI, what do you need to know? And I think it really boils down to the idea of being humble. It boils down to the idea of knowing what you don't know and being honest about it. I'll give you an example. There were things that I couldn't remember as an instructor. And it's not like specific things, but just on different days, you remember things and other times you don't. And so I would do ground lessons, specifically ones that were teaching towards like a stage check, which is kind of like an end of course test or kind of a mid course test. And I would go through and I'd ask a whole bunch of questions. Guess what? There were questions that I was asking that I didn't remember the answer to. And, you don't necessarily have to come out and say it right away, but it's one of those things where it was like, I would know the right answer if I heard it. And so in my head, I was so much hoping the student was going to get it right because I'd go, yep, that's the answer. It's when they go, I don't know. And they look at you and they're like, well, what's the right answer? And you're like,
Pause for reflection.
I don't know. And it's funny because they look at you and they'd be like, what do you mean you don't know? Like you're asking me the question. Well, yes, I know that. But you inject a little bit of humor into it and you're like, well, let's look it up together because part of the answer to this question, and this also includes instructors, is not knowing everything, but knowing where to find it.
Yeah.
It applies at all levels, ATP, flight instructor, private pilot, student pilot. I don't care who you are. There's no way you're going to know all those things. It's when you start bluffing and making stuff up and like vaguely answering questions that you start to find yourself in trouble because the students are going to sniff that out very early on and realize you're kind of full of BS and they're going to lose that extra bit of respect for you that they really need to have, because if they're going to trust you to sign them off on a test, they're going to trust you to sign them off on a solo, there has to be a high level of trust there, because that trust is then also going to translate into success on the actual test. I know for me, that's what it's like. If I don't feel like I'm prepared, but I know that my instructor signed me off, then my feeling can be, I'm trusting in them that they know that I know what I don't know.
Yeah, totally.
If that even makes sense to begin with. But again, the point is just making sure that you have that humbleness about you to say, okay, I don't remember, but let's find it. And that can also trigger this experience where they now remember it better because they know that you can't remember. So you'll find your own style. You don't have to be like your instructor or any of the instructors that you've had previously. You just have to be you and let that style develop itself.
Great advice. Absolutely great advice. One question before we kind of totally wrap up the episode, and don't let me forget to give our listeners the whole discount code for Nate's wonderful offerings. What do you think is like the highlight, like the juice of being a CFI? What's the thing that keeps people hooked to it? Or someone like Nate with this vaunted career still plugging away and helping people do this. What is that juice there?
I think it's watching people succeed. I mean, a good instructor watches people succeed. I mean, there's always going to be stumbling blocks. There's always going to be times where things don't necessarily go how you planned, but there's nothing like watching somebody come back from a first solo with the biggest smile on their face, or come back from a check ride and have their temporary certificate in their hands, and they come back and they thank you and like, oh, I couldn't have done this without you, and all that. Like, that just feels so good. And my favorite thing when I was an instructor was actually specializing in students that were struggling, because I know what that's like. I wasn't a hotshot student. I had to work extra hard, and I had some stumbling blocks myself. But I think that got me to a point where those were the students I wanted to help the most. And watching a student who struggled with another instructor, not because the other instructor wasn't doing a good job, but they just weren't meshing, or the teaching style wasn't working, and sitting down with this person and getting them across that finish line when they were starting to lose hope, when they were starting to feel like maybe this isn't for me. And next thing you know, they're private pilots, they're commercial pilots, they're working at an airline, they're at a NetJets or something like that. Like, to affect somebody's life in that positive way, it is so addicting and so much fun.
That's really cool. I love the whole lineage aspect of aviation, right? It's such a young industry. I mean, I'm a yogi. We trace back 6,000 years, that's like when I trace literally my teachers. We go way back. Aviation is such a baby, but it carries that lineage with it. Of like, who your teacher's teacher was or where they went, and that person helping the next person is so beautiful. And that's what I hear from you and from Nate too, that is the thing that like lifts us all up. And that's why you and I are here together. That, and if you struggled as a student, I have definitely struggled as a student. So I think like we identify with one another. We're a good match.
It's true. And one of the things that I really liked from all the conversation with Nate is just the idea that as an instructor, it doesn't have to always be reinventing the wheel. And you can use the resources that Nate provides to build yourself up, to kind of grade yourself. If you want to still build your own lesson plans, that's okay. And there is some intelligence to that. But then you can go back and compare what you come up with to what someone like Nate, who has spent years perfecting and revising these things, and see how close you got to that level. And it's always nice to have that, because otherwise you can create your own lesson plan, but then really not have any idea if it's any good or not. Now you're going into a check ride with untested lesson plans and uncompared lesson plans, or teaching your students with things that maybe they work, maybe it doesn't, maybe you're missing something you just don't even know. So utilizing the things that he has put together in whatever way makes sense to you, it's just such a great resource. And it's nice to see that someone like Nate has put these together.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And for all of you listeners out there, Nate has been so generous. He is giving all of you a 20% discount off of any of his products. And he has everything down from a much lower price point, entry, to what he calls the whole shebang, which is like everything he does, which I've had an opportunity to look at. And holy moly, that's like getting a PhD level worth of information with that whole shebang. So it's a 20% discount. I'll include it in the show notes, but it is thebackseatpilot.com, thebackseatpilot.com. And your promo code is, guess what? Calm Cockpit. Promo code Calm Cockpit gets you 20% off of everything under Nate's Backseat Pilot. So it's thebackseatpilot.com. Use that code Calm Cockpit and get 20% off. At the very least, go check it out, get on his newsletter list, and let it be part of your world, and share it with other people who are doing this work too, because it's time and, quite literally in his case, battle tested information, like literally battle tested. What a generous person too. I think it was great having him on. So thanks again to Nate. So people, as always, if you could drop us a little 5-star review, we super appreciate it. Help that algorithm to help the other people who love this kind of stuff find us. That's what it's all about. It's not about giving John and I 5 gold stars on our homework.
Though you could.
Although you could. We like to put that on the refrigerator as, perfectionists. We love that. But it's really nice because it helps put out that little beacon of light for other people who might be struggling and thinking like, there's something else I'm missing, and it might be a little bit of what we're offering here. So reviews are also appreciated as well as feedback. calmcockpit@gmail.com. We love, and I cannot say it enough, love hearing from you guys. We always talk about every single email we get, and it sparks ideas. So if there's something we haven't covered or we have covered and you want more of, let us know. calmcockpit@gmail.com. Thank you everyone so much for listening. Hope to see you in CFI land or anywhere else. And until next time, fly smarter.
and stress less.
Boston Tower 1 departure is Airbus 321. Traffic holding crossing runway 33 left, clear to land.